recording. There we go. If you don't want to be visible in the recording, just keep your camera off and use the chat function for your questions. That's everything from me for now. I'm going to hand over to George and Amanda. It's just after 25 to 7 and I'll be back in about 45 minutes. Have a lovely chat, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
This is where we go quiet.
That's true.
After having lots to say, we'll have nothing to say. We'll get starstruck.
There was always a bridge, you know, the gap to.
It's really nice to have this conversation with you, George. And
it's nice to have you here.
So tell me a bit more about what you do, because it's really fascinating. And what I want to know is, so just tell me a bit more about what you do and why you're doing it and why it's important to you, because it's fascinating. I find it really fascinating, given what I do.
I look at, it's death that I'm looking at. And today the topic will be grief. And how does it relate to that? Of course, I look at death from the Afrocentric death perspective. I'm African, I'm originally from Uganda, but I'm here in the UK, and there are so many people like me. Of course, when people die here, we often, not all of us, but most people are taken back, dead bodies are sent back, cremation is not part of it. And that's what I thought was quite interesting. Of course, asking very many questions. And the very basic question is, why is it that people have got to be taken back? That is a question that I'm still pursuing. And the answers are not simplistic as anyone would think, because different people have different reasons. But the word home tends to come in. Now, coming back to the question of today, when the body is sent back to Africa, what happens to the bereaved who are here? What happens to, how do they handle the grief? So it's a whole range of issues. And that's where, my study tries to search for answers. And as we go along, we'll be seeing what I've discovered so far in my research. Yes.
Can I ask you a question about the coming home? Because I was doing a sort of recent study of by American doulas who have developed this course to look at how we can make death more inclusive. And they were talking when one of the people who was doing the course, she talked about this idea of coming home, partly because so many African people were displaced because of being enslaved. And so that was created as a way to say that people were going home, even though they didn't go home. But it was really important to have that sort of viewpoint that there was this idea of coming home. And I'm really intrigued by that. What is that the same in Ghanaian culture, or?
Yes, the Gambians are the ones that I worked with. The word home is very, very important and very complex, but they believe that there is only one home, and that's the Gambia. You can live anywhere in the world. That will be a place where you've got probably a house where you live, but home as in home, where you're going to be buried finally, because the burial or death defines what home is. After someone has died and it is taken back, the place where he's buried, that becomes home. And that is nowhere else other than the Gambia. So it's very complex, because what happens when someone has lived here and he's got children and he's got a family and he's got these connections, what happens? But again, this particular person still identifies as Gambian. And when death occurs of that person, everyone who is Gambian and everyone who is African who can be reached, we seem to understand that the complexity between, home when you are away and home when you are home, we seem to understand that. And then there is the other force from, Africa itself. Once they get to know that someone has died here, they'll say, can you send back our child? So who owns the body at that? So eventually the word home becomes more complex, but also they look at issues like, where are we going to put this person and how shall we refer to that place where we have placed the person? Shall we ever refer to that? Because Africans tend to refer to the places where they buried their dead in informal, sort of informal introduction. Take, for example, when introducing myself among Africans, I would say, my name is Gumisiriza, son of so-and-so, grandson of so-and-so, great-grandson of so-and-so, buried in such and such a place, the son of so that kind of thing follows. But now when someone has not been taken back, that becomes difficult. So that's where the complexity is. And then coming back to, talking about grief in relation to that. First of all, Africans are known to cry loudly. So when someone dies here, you realize that they can't do it the way it should have been done at home. So where is the grief there? Is the grief simply tucked in and it's not being addressed? Or they are trying to say, okay, this is all. So that's where the word home comes in again, because if someone is going to be handled the way it is supposed to be and the brief comes out, they really want to know that all rituals have been fulfilled.
That's so interesting, George, because it really reminds me of there's a comedian called Rob Delaney, and his son, he's white. I think he's American. Yeah, he's American, and I think he's married to an English woman. That's why I'm thinking he might be English. But his young son died, and he said it was so difficult because the way that people dealt with the child's death, and he had an African American child carer who was looking after the baby, the little boy, and he said when she found out, he said her wailing was off the scale, and he said, but you know what, it was so nice to have someone almost representing how I was feeling inside.
Yes.
He said it was the first person to really acknowledge the pain outwardly of what he was feeling, and he said it was beautiful. I mean, it was disturbing, but he said it was wonderful to actually have an acknowledgement of her grief, but also reflecting his own grief, which actually maybe in Western society, it's much harder to find ways to express that grief. I think we're somewhere like Africa and even Sri Lanka, what are the cultural norms that allow people to grieve? And in Sri Lanka, it's very much about having the body at home, having and photographing the body and everyone looking at the body, and it's the person who's died becomes part of the like the ceremony. They're there, but they're in an open casket, so it's like they're there, and you can see them, and it becomes more normalized. And so I think it really helps the grieving process, to not for everybody obviously, but definitely in Sri Lanka, because it's a custom to have the person there, probably, and usually at home as well. Have the person at home. People come round, they'll come and say goodbye, and because it's normalized, people don't think anything of it. Children come, they'll have a cup of tea or whatever, have something to eat, and they'll play around this open casket, and very much like Ireland actually. And I think that's
actually you're right. This thing of crying loudly or wailing is very, very important. As I was thinking of today's, this question, I thought of how I lost my brother at the age of 15, and my brother was, I think he was 12. And I was away when he died. But when I came back, I cried loudly because I wanted someone to hear my grief. I wanted to sort of let them know that, you know, in Uganda, we live at the foot of Mount Rwenzori. Mount Rwenzori is one of the big mountains. But I wanted to cry so loudly that the person who was on top of the mountain, a big mountain, could hear my grief.
Wow.
And then they wanted to go and touch, you know, and shake him and tell him that, look, it's time for us to go out and play. And then I wanted to hug my mom, but my mom was wailing and everybody was joining in and so on. And then after a while, then that calms down. And then you realize that that is the proper grief. But when I look at recently what happened to me here, I lived with my cousin in London, and he left me in London in 2014 and went back to Africa to die.
Oh.
He was HIV positive, and it had developed into AIDS. And when he was leaving, he left me with a pair of socks, weatherproof socks, and a scarf. And he said these words. He said, George, I'm leaving. I might come back next summer, but I know winter is going to be very cold. These things will keep you, you know, warm. I wanted to wail because I knew he wouldn't come back. I wanted to cry loudly, but I couldn't because he was still alive. But even when he died, I couldn't. I lived in a flat high up. I couldn't. I was just in there saying, I was like, why can't you do it? So it's interesting that you mentioned how that girl, you know, yelled and wailed and so on. And that's the way the Africans, most Africans do it. But coming back to my study, when people send back a dead body, what happens? Do we talk about that grief? What do we do? And that brings me back to your study, doing death. So we end up doing grief rather than talking about it. What do you think?
I agree, George, actually. Of course. Because I was just thinking, actually, fun enough, while you were talking, that, I mean, there's so many things about, it's great. There's lots more openings about grief. There's more podcasts, there's more books, there's more public speaking about it on social media. And even though I'm talking about death, I've sort of not veered too much into the grief sort of world, because although I study it as part of my doulaing training, and obviously it goes hand in hand with what I do, my whole thing is that, you know, the reason why we do grief so bad is because we do death so bad in you know, in Western society, I feel. And I think we could take a leaf out of some of the other cultures, because there's more of an openness about death, because there's cultural norms and rituals around dying, which, you know, we've lost here. And really that role became very much part of medical care. So the death ritual was taken over by a more medicalized society. So hospitals were then dealing with death and dying rather than communities. And so part of what I'm doing with doing death is trying to bring that conversation back into the communities, to say, you know, yeah, it is hard. Death is always going to be hard to talk about. But if we can try and normalize that and talk about it and understand it, then it's almost like you can go backwards. I mean, part of why I started doing death was I was working in a hospice, I was volunteering in a hospice. I gave up my job in advertising, and I wondered what I could do. You know, I gave up to look after my 3 children. But while they're at school, I thought, I need to do something because I'm going to go mad. So I ended up volunteering in the hospice because I've always been quite intrigued by death and just wanting to do it better. I think wanting to know how I could help make things better in that process. And what I found in the hospice, although hospices are incredible, I felt my role was to go into hospices and to talk to people that only had about 2 weeks left to live. And that was really hard because although I love talking and I love people, people have got so much to deal with at that point because they haven't dealt with a lot of stuff in their life. So it really got me thinking about what's going on here. Why is it people are so traumatized at this point? It's because they never thought about death and dying. They've just been in a denial that it was going to happen. And because of that, I don't think they've lived as well as they could have done. I.e., you know, not made amends with family. You know, they left things till very late, you know, like their bucket list of traveling, they left it really late. They didn't do those things and they really regretted it. And I just thought, you know, if I could rewind to the point before people go into the hospice, you know, what use could that be? So then I thought about doing death and setting up the resource website. And then I looked at training as a doula to help more in the hospice because I didn't feel very useful. And it kind of evolved from there, actually. And I realised the more I talked about death in my own way, the more people wanted to listen. And that was really encouraging because I thought, I want to talk about it, but actually other people want to talk about it. So then I helped set up my own death cafe, which is a place where you'd come and it's like a informal space in a coffee shop. And you know, it's like an event. So I normally run mine in an evening and it's probably about 2 hours long and people can come and talk about death. And that was just, I mean, when I think about the death cafes that I've had and I've been to, but also hosted, those conversations are so intimate and so enlightening and so inspiring. And you come away feeling really enriched about happy to be alive, but also enriched by the conversations that we had. So it was never doom and gloom. It was never doom and gloom. I mean, obviously there's so much grief. You know, a lot of people come to Death Cafe to go somewhere to talk about death because they're grieving so hard. And they don't, there's no space for people to openly talk about grief and death. And so that's why Death Cafes are brilliant. I don't know if you've been to it.
I think the medical bit of it somehow overshadows the talking. So we end up not getting the space to talk about death because of, you know, the different procedures and so on, the structure in which it is, the medical bit, the professional bit. So somehow it takes away. But the doing death, I think, cuts through grief and then memorialization. I often walk the cemetery, and I'm always fascinated to see how many colors would be on a particular grave. We could call it memorization, but sometimes if the grave is still fairly new, I would think that that is grief, because I think there is a very thin line between grief and memorization of the dead. I wouldn't go into the details of, you know, describing what the difference, but you get to see different colors on the same grave, and you are like, what's the color of grief if these people are grieving? Are they from the same family? And if they're one is putting blue, another one red, another one pink, another one yellow, are they able to sit down and talk about this? So we realize that there is less talking in terms of grief, but there is more doing. And what does that mean? It means that spaces like this should prevail. And then people who are able to inspire the talk, to talk about grief, to talk about death, should be able to do that. However, even from the Afrocentric perspective, you realize that people can talk people talk about death only when it has occurred. That's what I gathered from the Gambians here. Once death occurs, they are able to talk about it. And how do they talk about it? First of all, the authority to talk about death is sort of invested in the spiritual leader, or so it is encapsulated, so they don't get still the freedom to talk about that. But they are able to talk about it when they are mobilizing funds to take back the body. Everybody gets involved. Talk to your friend and collect the funds, and we take our brother back. And when that is done, that's it. It stops there. So in some way, I would think that people, even in that, research, I gathered that people are happy to talk about death of someone else, but not death involving themselves. Like, for example, I'm not sure I can start and say, when I die, that is a bit scary. So you wonder why. They will say, oh, when someone dies, or when an African dies, it's not like when I die. And I think we seem to share that among, the Western perspective, if you like, the Eurocentric perspective, and the African perspective. So death seems to be still somewhere. Because we don't talk about death, then we can't talk about grief. And when we can't talk about grief, then it brings all sorts of challenges. You talked about, how death would sort of, I wouldn't want to say empower, but encourage people to have a better sort of life. What did you mean by that?
Wow. How long have you got, George? I mean, I'm also a life coach as well as a death doula, which is kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
But it kind of makes sense because, life coaching is about identifying what people need, what areas in their life they want to look at, and then you create actions in order to meet their, what they want to achieve. And in a way, I use my life coaching bizarrely when I'm doulaing someone. So I'm doulaing someone at the moment who's dying. She's a young woman, and she has a daughter. And the questions that I ask her, what do you want? What's important to you right now? What's the most important thing? And I've got loads of skills that I can offer her, like practical advice. I can do advanced care planning for her. I can help organise her funeral. But she doesn't want any of that. What she wants, she just wants to talk to someone about how she's feeling. And inevitably, when people are talking about how they're feeling, they're talking about their life, and they're talking about, the people that they love and that the life they've had together. And there's a lot of grieving. I mean, there's a lot of anticipatory grief.
Yes.
Which is the grief where you're, for instance, this lady that I'm working with, she's very teary, and we talk about that, and we talk about this being grief for herself, grief for her life, grief for the fact that she won't be here. So she's grieving her life before she's died. Her family are grieving, but with a long-term illness like cancer or any long-term illness, there's a preparation time. It's not fun, but I think in a way it prepares you more than a sudden death, because the family and the person have got, if they ever come to terms with it, but they have a bit of time to at least say you'd think that they have some of the things that they'd want to say. But I always think the things that are important to people when they're dying, because people don't really die until they're dead, so they're still living. So I'm really aware of that people are still living, and I like to treat them I don't like them to treat them as if they're a dying person, because they're a living person. So I'm very wary to, I say, what do you want to achieve in the next week? What's important to you? And that might be having a shower, and then you really think about, particularly for me, and even when I'm working in the hospice, I come out and everything's more technicolor, because life just seems so intense in a way, and so beautiful. you know, it takes me a few minutes to come home and see my children and it's chaos.
Mm.
But that's life, you know, that's entering into that life. And
Mm.
so it just always makes me think about that process of what does that mean? How do we live?
Mm.
We normally die how we live as well.
Mm.
So it's very much about finding a way to think about what's important to us at the end, but also in life, if we were to imagine if we didn't have much time left, you know, what would our life look like? What would be the things that were important to us? What were the things that we'd want to do? You know, and just trying to make good use of our time here. And I think that's, you know, a lot of people regret that at the end. They feel like they haven't made use of their time and they thought they had so much more time left. So there's a real grief of the life they could have lived, which is really interesting.
Thank you for that. I understand what you meant by better life. But you know, when I think about grief myself, I think from the Afrocentric perspective, I really see it as in talking about it is embedded in the death rituals and the funeral rituals that sometimes accompany, you know, an occurrence of death. There are some cultures that hold some different sessions of rituals after a certain period of time. There is a culture that is based in Uganda where people dance. After maybe 6 months, they organize, everyone will come from everywhere and they organize the dance. And this is a funerary dance. And it's called Echiriro. Echiriro would mean some kind of a crying space. But people are playing drums that are specific to death. They are playing the xylophones that are specific to death, and people will come and dance in a circle. And I remember very well, there was this woman who had lost a son 6 months earlier, and the drums were playing, people are moving around the circle, others could come in the middle of the circle and dance. But when this woman stepped into the circle to dance, she was probably the best dancer, you know, of the time. But as soon as she started dancing, tears were flowing down her eyes. And the rest of the women who were around were crying too. So at that, what did I see? For me, I could see the grief. And then for her, she felt the grief. And the drums could they were drums of grief. You could know that there is grief here. And everyone was fully involved with a lot of vigor. And at that, when I think about it now, I realize that actually, with grief, especially among some cultures, it sort of takes a shape of the senses, the 5 senses, the smell, the touch, the taste, the sight, and the hearing. And it's like there may not be a particular order, okay, but talking comes last. When I lost my own grandmother, there is a feast that was held after 3 days of her burial because she was a woman. When had she been a man, then it would have been 4 days. They hold a feast, and then the personal property and the personal belongings are also shared among friends and family members. But I remember, you know, the feast was so good, but I couldn't eat the food. It tasted bitter, and there was something strangling me here. I couldn't swallow. And I wondered, why is it that other people are enjoying the beef stew, the millet bread, the mashed bananas, and all the delicious food? And for me, it tastes bitter. Can they see that my grandmother was the best cook and she's now dead and they are here eating? And I realized that, okay, I now realize that this was grief. Something was strangling me here, and all I needed was to have someone to hug me, to see that I was grieving. But while we are here now, and given the circumstances, it's very difficult to see if someone is grieving, even when you see the person, and if someone does not tell you what they are going through, then the talking cannot start. Because at that moment when I was going through that, I remember my mother coming and sitting next to me and asking me what is going on. And I'm like, the food doesn't taste nice. And she was like, really? So she took a bit of what I was eating. And she was, but it's all right. I was like, no, it's not all right. But she didn't take it any further because probably she didn't perceive that I was grieving. So grief through the senses, and that other extra thing that, you know, holds someone by the neck. I don't know whether it is a shared experience among other people. Have you heard about anything like that?
Yes, well, actually, as you're talking, I mean, grief presents itself physically in many people. I mean, you know, the tightening of the chest, you know, the turmoil in the stomach, you know, the achiness in the head, you know, there's headaches, palpitations, anxiety. You know, it presents itself physically, so it makes sense that it would affect your senses. And you know, and like you say, you know, like a smell or a sound or a song, it can remind you so vividly of the person that's died. And so I think it is a very sensory experience, grief. And I think, and I guess it's that thing, isn't it, where people just expect you to move on and, you know, after a month or so to be okay. And it's an ongoing process. And I thought it was really interesting you talking about the dancing, because, you know, there's a whole thing about a lot of grief experts talk about how movement and exercise is really good for letting grief move through you. So not denying that you're grieving, but using something like exercise or dancing to let it work through you. And maybe the crying is like a release, you know, like you were saying, you know, that this lady was crying after her dancing, and maybe that's just the movement, you know, the energy of the grief moving through you. And I think that's so important what you just said, and really important for us. I read something really interesting today. It was a really beautiful just a tiny little written piece about this man's experience with grief, and he said it's like, initially it's like 100-foot wave hitting you, and it's so powerful, and you sort of come up for air and you're okay, but you're struggling. And then he says, and then you feel okay and you're sort of, you know, floating around, and then you see another wave coming, and it's like, and it's 100 feet, and it's like boom. And then he said over time those waves get a bit smaller, so they're like 80 foot rather than 100 foot. They still hit you, but the intensity of the hit is not as fierce. So but he said, you know, for him the waves always came, and they might have got smaller, but they were always there. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of describing grief, that there's an ebb and flow with it, and it's almost like we need to accept that that's, I guess, the cyclical nature of grief. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes, and it may lessen over time, but it will never go away. And it's just having a better understanding of that, and doing things that, you know, and that might be just being at home and being quiet and having some time for yourself to internalize what's going on, or it could be going out running, or it could be dancing. You know, it's whatever you feel your body might need, and just letting that pain come, because all that pain is suppressing the pain. And that's when, you know, people can start drinking, or they get depressed, or they need medication, or, you know, you can't deny that grief is a very powerful emotion. And this whole idea that the more that you loved that person, the more intense your grief's going to be. So I think it's really hard, but I think there's this beauty of how much you loved that person. The grief is an indicator of that.
Yeah, and I agree, because I mean, I did talk about, you know, the pair of socks that my cousin left me, and that was 2014. And I've always done this pair of socks every time I think about him. And of course, no one sees the socks because, I mean, the trousers and the shoes, so you won't see the socks. But when I'm wearing that pair, I'm sort of grieving in a way. And recently something happened. Years have gone, how many years now? 2014. And a hole has appeared in the socks. But I realized that I picked a needle to sort of fix the hole because I don't want to let go of the pair. So I tried to sort of sew and, stitch the hole, but it can't, unfortunately, it's unmendable because it's so big unless I'm going to get another patch and put it. So I'm in between there. Do I give up the socks? Do I get another pair that is similar to that? Will it serve the same purpose? Or do I keep it as, so you were saying grief doesn't go away, and it's true. It just creeps in slowly. And it doesn't matter when someone died or how long it has taken. People have talked of time, sort of being a healer. I'm not sure about that. I don't want to oppose it because, people perceive grief differently. But for me, time has not worked. It hasn't, because recently I sent for a picture of my brother, and this is the only surviving picture I've got as a child. I'm 5 and he's 3, he's 2. And I can see him, I can still connect. So I look at that and sort of move it to the time when he died. And I begin to imagine how he would be and what would be doing and the mischief behind that. And, wrapping up all that, it still comes back to grief. And I'm like, this is very interesting, But looking at what is happening now, in COVID, COVID pandemic, what are we going to do? Especially for those people who are death scholars and those who are interested in promoting, the conversation to talk about grief, talk about death. How are we going to be talking about that? Because people have missed out on a number of things. They haven't seen, they haven't done the rituals the way they're supposed to be. And some of them, like, for example, those who should have been repatriated to Uganda or to Africa, have not been taken. How do we begin to talk about that? Would you think of any ideas? Probably.
It terrifies me that I spoke to Cruz Bereavement, who are, do you know Cruz?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so they're like a bereavement group, and they offer a free phone call service where you can ring up and talk to them. And I think I was championing them on one of my podcasts, and I rang up to ask if that was okay, and I managed to get through to them. And it was right in the middle of the pandemic, and the woman was saying, we are absolutely inundated. We do not have enough people on the line. She said she goes, I am so concerned about the outcome in years to come of this, because as you say, there's displacement, there's a lack of reality of what's happened, because people haven't been able to say goodbye properly. They haven't been able, back then you couldn't even go to a funeral. It was, it was all done online, and it was just, I think there was like a tiny amount of people that could go. It wasn't 30. And it was just, I worry that the long-term effects of a grief, maybe like we had in the war, where people went away to fight and they didn't come back. But what happened with the war was, here, especially in the West, was that people then buried that emotion, and we'd stopped talking about death because it was so painful. And I really don't want that to happen. That's my fear, is that this might make people go underground about how they're feeling. And that's the worst thing that can happen. We need to find ways to help people express what they've been through and how they've coped with that. And that could be talking groups. You know, that's why things like this are really good, because there's so much grief around. And it might not just be grief about someone that's died, it's grief, it's complete loss, change of life for so many people, loss of job, loss of home, loss of finances, loss of what people consider normality. So we're in a huge state of, I think, grief and change and transformation. And I really feel this is a chance really to try and get it right. To you know, there's quite a few events. Actually, there was one that went on during lockdown called, I think it's called Grief Fest, and that was brilliant. That was all an online thing, and it was just the perfect timing, and it was hugely successful. And I think it's because people needed somewhere to go to hear about other people's grief, to identify with other people's griefs, to understand what they were going through. And yes, I just really hope we can keep the conversation going, which is why it's so important that people like you and I and people that are here are listening and learning and thinking, how can we help people? How can we show up for people that are grieving? And actually, talking of that, if you want to show up for someone's grieving, you know, just to be there, just to keep showing up, don't disappear a month after the person's died, you know, just to be a continued support. And that might just be a text saying, are you okay? Should I come over? Do you want to go out and see a film? You know, just making sure that person's can have a sense of normality during this. I mean, a friend of mine, she's her mother's Jamaican, both her parents are from Jamaican descent. She's born here, and her mum died in January of COVID. And I mean, and she was pregnant, so she had her baby a week after her mum died. So it's been absolutely horrendous. And she's, what are we, January, February, March, April, May, June? Yeah, we're 5 months in now, 6 months in, and everything that she's gone through. She also felt that because her mum was black, she wasn't treated properly in the hospital. There are things that she's now having flashbacks about, that she's thinking, I don't think they would have done that otherwise, you know. So she's having all these things, because she wasn't there to be an advocate for her mum. She wasn't there to protect her. She wasn't there to speak for her. And so she's got this guilt. I mean, it's, you know, it's really hard. So I think there's going to be a lot of repercussions from it. I just think we just need to be aware of that. If we know anyone who's, you know, someone who's lost, you know, someone who's died, one of their friends or family, we just need to be present for that person and, you know, available. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a tough one, that, George.
I think I agree. Absolutely. I agree. And it's something that we can, you know, continue talking about and thinking about, but it's here. And I think that the pandemic, it gives us a starting point, though it's not obvious that everybody has lost somebody, which is sort of an assumption. People assume that everybody has lost. You know, not everybody has lost, but it gives us a starting point of saying, look, death is among us. Can we talk about it? Let's not run away from it.
That's a really good point, George.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you run the country?
Yeah, I second that.
Thanks, Amanda.
Go, George, go.
Thank you both. I jumped back, I turned my camera back on and I jumped back in. Amanda, just when you were talking just a moment ago about, I guess, our collective responsibility to think and to work out together how to move through this period of immense loss and grief which we're in because of COVID and for all the other reasons that you mentioned. And that felt like a very apt moment for me to pop back and for us to open up the conversation to everybody who's here. So to make this a collective, a conversation for everyone who's present. But before we move on to that, thank you. That was really, really wonderful. I I know when we met at 6 o'clock, you two were slightly worried in case you didn't know what to talk about for 45 minutes. But I know that if I hadn't come back, you'd have gone all night. And I'm sure the people who are listening in and watching wish that I had not come back, because I think for you to share everything that you've just shared, it's such a privilege to be able to listen in on that conversation, and how you have done that to bring your incredible professional expertise, but to wrap that up in some intensely personal insights and the things that you've shared about yourselves. It was incredible. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we've got about 20-25 minutes left. So just to remind everybody who's here how the next little part of the conversation works. If you have a question for Amanda or for George or for both of them, or a comment or a reflection on what's been discussed, you have a couple of choices. You can either turn on your camera and raise your hand, and I'll invite you to ask your question. If you'd rather use the raise hand function, you can do that. If you prefer not to be seen, you can just type your question in the chat, and I'll take the questions from the chat and I'll ask them of Amanda and George. So I invite all you lovely people who are here to pick up some of those beautiful, fascinating threads and take us wherever you would like to go next. Katie, Taylor, thank you so much for kicking us off.
Hi, no, that was brilliant, really, really fascinating. And it's not really questions, just a kind of thought as you were talking. The bit where you were talking about how we tend in this country certainly to be quiet and not cry loudly was something that I felt really personal to myself, because when I lost both my parents, you know, I desperately wanted to wail loudly. And I think we kind of feel like we shouldn't here, and I think that's kind of wrong. I think you should be allowed to behave in any way you feel is appropriate to yourself. But I think society, you know, I think there's all sorts of societal reasons why we perhaps don't. And the other thing was, George, you need to darn your socks. I'll darn your socks for you. It's, you know, you've got to keep them going. And
oh, thank you for that. That's very kind.
So important. You've got to keep those going. That, you know, and there's a whole, you know, I'm an artist, and George knows.
Yes.
Artists, but there are a lot of artists that do this whole kind of darning thing to kind of keep belongings like that important,
sure.
like that. So if we get to meet up, I shall be darning your socks for you.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind. That's very kind. I need the socks. I do need.
And it's so important. And, you know, I mean, all my work is about belongings and about the importance of belongings. And absolutely, you do need to keep them. I don't think anything else would stand in for them. And even if they're darned to be completely replaced by darning, they're still those socks originally.
And you know, more to that, I've taken to dancing in the morning on my morning walks, and I realized it's another way of grief, because my cousin was a professional dancer. So I am good at walking, but nowadays when I walk, I tend to dance a lot. I don't know, if someone stood somewhere and watched, they'd say that one is crazy, you know, dancing on the road. And about, you know.
As long as you're not naked in your socks, George.
No.
I can't get that picture of my head. George in his socks.
Yeah, because I'm trying to substitute the socks, saying if the sock cannot be mended, then I will dance it off.
Good idea.
Yeah.
That's such a fantastic image. Thank you.
No,
Thank you
Amanda is.
Is there somebody else who'd like to come in with a response or a thought? I'd like to pick up on something that really struck me, and actually to quote George. Has George gone?
He's there.
Here I am.
Sorry, I was too busy scanning across multiple screens. I'm just going to quote something you said, George, because it was such a brilliant statement when you were talking about the ritual dance in Uganda, which you described as a crying space, and then you said everybody was fully involved with a lot of vigor.
Yes.
And when you talked about vigor, and I think that came just after or just before, Amanda, you were talking about through your work, your sense that sometimes people, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but perhaps didn't live vigorously enough because they weren't thinking about the reality of the ending that's coming to all of us. And those two things together really struck me. And an abundance of vigor for you, George, and maybe Amanda, you talked about a lack of vigor, perhaps. I don't know. It's not a question, but I just wondered if either of you could pick up on that. I just love that you're talking about vigor in a conversation about grief.
Yes.
Well, because, you know, it's like I was saying, you know, we are living until we're dead, right? So even when people are dying, you know, they have a terminal, you know, life-limiting illness. People don't like to say terminal illness anymore. People are still living as well as they can do. And sometimes that's even with more vigor because they've got nothing to lose. And I just think I wish people would have that, you know, like Katie was saying about the wailing, I wish people would just show their emotions a little bit more and be a bit more braver with how they're feeling and what they want to do and living life with more vigor, because, you know, it isn't for that long and it's not an endless amount of time that we have. And that time is very precious. But actually I was thinking about the wailing because a friend of mine is he's a choral master. He started something in lockdown called the Sofa Singers, and it's like an online singing platform that he started. And he was saying that when people sing, something happens, people's hearts and body rhythms regulate. And I was thinking, I wonder if it's the same thing that when with the wailing, because sound is like a vibration, isn't it? It's like a really powerful healing tool, really. And I was thinking, I wonder whether if there are a lot of people wailing at the same time, whether there's some sort of unified physiological thing that is going on with hearts, because your hearts sing apparently when you're singing. Like they've done studies on it. You can go and have a look at it. It's really interesting. And I was wondering whether with the sound of the wailing, whether there's something similar in that process, and maybe there's something quite meditative about the wailing and quite healing probably, as well as it being a release. There's something in a group wailing that I think sounds quite interesting. You know, it'd be quite interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of unified link up with everybody during the wailing.
Yeah, actually, picking from where you've ended, wailing is always sort of musical. It's not just there are people who are known to wail properly. They make it. There are some who may not make it as musical as others will, but in most cases there is always a rhythm, there is always a flow, there is always, and then they're articulating words and so on. If some people will sort of produce some kind of mini rap, if you like. And then coming back to the vigor that David talked about, this is an activity. It's these funeral rites, funeral rites surrounding this kind of dance to have been prepared for over a period of time, 6 months, for example. And then people gather from different places. So dance is one of the activities that will take place. There will be feasts, there will be different families coming in-laws and so on. But when it comes to that particular dance and people are playing, once the drum begins to play, and the best drummers will have come in the village, and some dancers, like the young people, will dance, not particularly because they've lost anyone, but the parents now, when they begin to take to the dance floor, then people will know that so-and-so is dancing because so-and-so died in their family. So the circle will sort of expand and contract as people fall out and others. Some people will give space for others. Others will be coming. So like that, but the vigor is there and it doesn't lose, and it can go on for hours. For hours, maybe 6 hours, it doesn't lose the beat, it doesn't lose. People are taking over, drumming in turns, and the crying continues. And you don't get to know who is crying for who unless the person is the parent. Like that woman, I think everybody was touched. I couldn't even remember the name of the son. I think it was called Moses or something. So there is Nya Moses. Nya means mother of Moses. So people are talking about Nya Moses. And it was hard. I couldn't cry myself because I was taken up by the beauty of the dance, because it's not my own culture, but the dance itself was so beautiful and vigorous. Yeah.
Thank you both. I have a question which has come through the chat from HG. Thank you for this. With these chat questions, I'm just going to read them verbatim. I shan't paraphrase. Inspiring conversation. Many thanks for your reflections. Any thoughts, advice for processing sudden death, especially with young children, as we come to our 2nd year anniversary of their father's passing? They are aged 6. Still feeling in shock, but rituals can be soothing for us and our friends. So any thoughts, advice for processing sudden death, especially with young children? Thank you, HG, for that question.
Yeah, thank you. And I can imagine how, well, I can't imagine how hard it must be right now. And I think it's always really hard with sudden death because there's always that shock. And I think it's just, I think maybe marking it in a sort of ritual way for the children. My friend's father of her 3 children actually died suddenly as well. And she always marks the anniversary. They might go to his grave, or they might go, there was a tree that he particularly liked actually in a field, so they might go and have a picnic under the tree, and she encourages talking about him and sharing their emotions. You know, how what would it be like if, you know, Dad could see us eating this right now, you know, I wonder what he'd like to eat, and almost sort of including him in that conversation. And she said they do it every year. She's now, I think, yeah, it's about 6 years now, and it doesn't get easier, I have to say, but she's somehow normalized the conversation around his death as much as she can. He died in a really tragic way of a heroin overdose, and so they're all aware how he died. But I think because she marks his death every year, you know, in quite a beautiful way, or they'll make a cake, and you know, they constantly have a conversation about him. That's really helpful. It's been really helpful. They've had a lot of help from Winston's Wish. They've been amazing, actually, that charity. I don't know if you're aware of it, HG, but whether you've used them, but they're really helpful. They've got a lot of resources and really helpful books as well, which could be helpful. There's actually a beautiful book called The Invisible String. I don't know whether you've come across that, and it's about the ties that we have with people, but that's been used a lot in counselling with children whose, you know, one of their parents has died, because it's about this idea that no matter where that parent is, they'll always be connected with through this invisible string. And it's a really beautiful book, but it's a really interesting understanding for a child to know that even though that person's not there anymore, they'll still be connected to them through the love that they had with that person. So that's quite a good book, actually, The Invisible String. I definitely recommend that. It's really, really beautiful.
Yeah, for me, I would say, oh, sorry, were you? So for me, I would say that it must be very difficult, but I would start from where, I mean, finding out what the children know and what they think. Let them tell you. if they said what they think and what they know and how far, how much information they've got, then if you add it to what Amanda was saying, then it makes, it gives you a way forward. Because even when we go for counseling and so on, sometimes the models miss out certain little bits. You know, they are not watertight to find that they can give us everything. But once you get to know how much they know, and that gives you a structure of where to start from. And sometimes we might be surprised to find what the children know about what happened, and they've only been waiting to sort of let someone ask them so that they can talk. I think, and then they suggest what they want to do in, you know, terms of talking about the loss itself. But definitely seeking professional, you know, help is always important.
And also my friend, she worked quite closely with the school, so she made them aware when the anniversary was coming up, and they've given them some counselling, the school, which has been really helpful. And she's done a lot of research about child resilience and how to build child resilience. But I think she has a very open conversation. You know, she allows them to, like George was saying, to have a conversation with her. And I think it's about creating a space to listen. You know, it doesn't matter how small they might think it is. It's just what they might be thinking of, you know. It could be something they heard that they've misconstrued, or that's worried them, and it's given them a fear of death, or you know, something that didn't sit right with them. And it's just saying, you know, how are you? How are you doing today? And also understanding that the next day will be very different for them as well. It's like a constant involvement.
Thank you both. Thank you. And I just had a private message from HG saying many thanks for these thoughts. So thank you so much for that. I have a reflection and then a question from Caroline. And again, I'll just read them as they've come to me in the chat. So firstly, a reflection, and thanks for these, Caroline. I absolutely loved the morning dancing. I believe we all benefit from having a process for grieving. We've sadly capitulated to capitalism that doesn't make space for healing and thresholds. Similarly, with healthcare professionals who are forced into boxes of fixing and have forgotten how to heal themselves and others. Also, grief comes from death in many different guises: death of dreams, relationships, not having children. Music, dancing, innate expressions, heart as opposed to mind. Thanks for this, has been life affirming, dying to live. That's beautiful, thank you. And then a question from Caroline to follow on from that. So here's Caroline's question. How can we mourn and mark deaths of loved ones where we've been excluded from funerals by direct family? Is the trauma of death one we mark retrospectively? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, my dad and I had an estranged relationship, and he died a couple of years ago, and it was all very political. I would have liked to have gone to his funeral, but my other brothers and sisters who were from his first marriage organised the funeral without telling my sister and I, and it was all done really quickly, and we weren't invited, and it happened, and that was really awful actually for me. But I did do my own thing. You know, I mean, it was just something silly, sitting in a field and saying goodbye to him. And my sister and I went through all pictures of him, and it felt okay, weirdly. It felt, I mean, we were sent some pictures of the funeral, and obviously it wasn't the same, but I think it's difficult because it almost doesn't feel real because you haven't been to the funeral, but you know it's. And also my husband's stepfather died, who was very close to him. He's Australian, so he was in Australia, and so there was a sort of displacement because they were always, you know, because they were in Australia, we didn't see them that often, but it just didn't seem real that he had died because we couldn't go to the funeral. So it was just about marking with just you know, maybe a cake. I remember doing something for my father, you know, my father-in-law, a cake, and I might speak to him, you know, just when he was here last, I used to give him green juice, you know, I had wheatgrass, and he absolutely hated it, but he used to drink it, and it always makes me laugh when I'm drinking wheatgrass, because I'm thinking, God, Gordon would have hated this. So I link to him with memories. I link to him with smells. My dad loved pineapples. So and it goes back to what George was saying about smell and the senses, you know, when I smell that pineapple, I'm taken back to Sri Lanka, when we used to buy pineapples from the woman on the beach, and my dad would slice them up, and he'd put them in the sea, and we'd eat this sort of salty pineapple. Sounds gross now, but it was delicious. And I have that real evocative memory when I smell a pineapple, and I'm sort of taken to him. So I wonder if there's some memories that you had with that person that might remind you of them and allow you to sort of just think about them, you know, and like George was saying, you know, those senses, or a song or music, you know, something that this lady that I'm doulaing, she is actually planning her funeral, and her and her husband listened to songs that they were going to play at her funeral, and she said they both sat there crying, but she said it was really beautiful because the music that they listened to meant so much to them. So there's lots of things we can do. There's this really weird Sri Lankan, it's like a folk tale, but it was massive in Sri Lanka in the 50s. And I heard it on the radio the other day, and I literally started sobbing. And it really took me back to my childhood. So I think there are lots of reminders of that person, even though we didn't go to their funeral. They're all around us in everything,
That's
like
true.
George's socks, you know.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, being here and my wider family is in Uganda, people die, and it's so difficult. You know, to begin with, it becomes very difficult. But as time goes by, not a long time, like I said, you begin to figure out how you're going to begin to memorialize this person. Could it be a choice of food? You know, the kind of drink you're going to choose. And sometimes when I'm drinking when I've chosen a particular drink, I'm not drinking so-and-so, but somehow seeing so-and-so participating in that, because that's what you would have done. It could be a choice of color that I'm wearing that day. You know, everyone is wearing red and I'm wearing blue, just because behind the blue, there is the face of this person, and the face of that person is no longer here, but to me is still visible in some way. And I think it's important to take it a bit lighter than being hard on yourself, because when you get to bring grief and combine it with someone who denied you the right to attend the funeral, then it becomes more complex. But if the two are separated, to say, look, I'm looking at this one, he's the person I loved, he's the person I want to memorialize. You who excluded me, I don't care. After all, he's not alive. So I'm going to see him this way. I think that helps in a way. I don't know, it would help me in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, George, and thank you, Amanda. We've come to the end of our time together. It went so quickly, and we could definitely keep going. I could listen to you two talk forever, I think. And it's so strange. It's felt like such an intimate, I felt so present with you. Like you felt so present. I'm at home, in my home. We've never met, even though we're doing this together. One day we will meet, and while George dances vigorously in his threadbare socks,
I'll be darning his socks.
Amanda, no, you'll be eating salted pineapple, which I'm going to give to you. Thank you both. Thank you for a beautiful, rich, really interesting and useful conversation. It was brilliant.
That's very kind.
Thank you. It's
And
been
thanks,
a real pleasure to spend some time with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone.
So we're getting lovely clap responses. I know that George and Amanda, you can't see all the screens that I can see. We're getting lovely comments in the chat. So thank you everybody who has been and has attended this conversation. Thank you everyone, Katie, HG, Caroline, for your questions and responses. Go safely, take care, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.